I need to correct a fact and clarify some things about the Krieger Armory Sentinel HEMA longsword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I recently, just a few days ago in fact, put up a review of this sword. That is the Sentinel HEMA longsword, blunt, flexible, blunt-ended, flared, tipped training sword, fencing sword from Krieger Armory. Before I go on, I just point out they do also do Federschwert. I talked about some of the pluses and minuses of this type of sword. That's not specific, of course, to Krieger Armory. I specifically asked for a shiltless sword. Many people out there prefer to train with HEMA longswords that don't have a shilt and aren't a Feder, so this is probably for you. Now, the main thing I need to clarify, and in fact correct, completely correct what I said, was about distal taper. Several times in my video, I stated that this blade does not have distal taper and is therefore quite wobbly. Okay, now, first of all, it is quite wobbly, but what I didn't realize is it does actually have some distal taper. Not a huge amount, but it does have some. And Sean at Krieger Armory wanted me to clarify that, and I'm very happy to do so because I was categorically wrong to state that it didn't have any distal taper. It does have a little bit. Okay, so it starts at inside the sort of bar stock that they make it from, so inside the tang, it's about 4.75 millimeters. I've actually measured using my calipers here. I won't show it on screen because it's boring for you to watch, but I've measured just now here, and at the base it comes out as 4.6 on my calipers, okay, because obviously once you've ground and polished and blah blah blah, you lose a little bit of a fraction of a millimeter. So 4.6 just in front of the guard here. Now it stays pretty much the same thickness all the way up to here, but then in this last portion of the blade, and bear in mind as I showed on screen, that is the section of the blade that flexes. I put that down fully down to the taper in this direction, but it turns out it's partly due to that and partly due to some distal taper. It actually goes down, if I measure it at its thinnest point before it flares at the tip, this comes out at 2.9 millimeters. Yeah, 2.9 millimeters. So actually that's not an inconsiderable distal taper. For most of this it's in the sort of between 3 and 4 millimeters. So we've gone from 4.6, it stays pretty much the same up until about just after the fullers. Then it steps down to 3 point something, and it gets down to about 3 millimeters, in fact 2.9 just before here. And actually Sean sent me a nice graphic showing one of these blades being manufactured and being weighed on the scales before and after adding distal taper. And before taking off the distal taper off this portion of the blade up here, the foible, the weak, it is 6 ounces heavier. I know I'm switching between metric and imperial here, but those are the stats I have to hand. So it's 6 ounces heavier before the distal taper is removed. Now, not only is that 6 ounces of mass off the blade, but of course it's 6 ounces right at the end of the blade, which has the greatest effect on how the blade handles and flexes. You'll also notice, if you look at the flared tip, I noted to you before that it is flared in that direction. It is also flared in that direction, and if I put it near the camera, you can probably see it is thicker at the end than it is down here, and that is because it's obviously made of flat bar stock originally, and this distal tape has been ground down. So you can see for it to flare out again, clearly there is distal taper going on. So my error, I apologise for that. It does absolutely have some distal taper. Not just to slightly mitigate the kind of like me saying, I'm not saying the opposite totally. It does have relatively minimal distal taper, but that being said, there are historical swords, 100% there are historical swords which are only 4.5 millimeters thick at the base. They're about the thinnest historical swords that I'm aware of. These are sharp, real, original medieval swords, but nevertheless it's not unhistorically thin up here. I personally think that it could potentially be a stiffer blade and be a slightly better functioning blade if it was slightly thicker bar stock, but then again, I've been using this for drilling, as I pointed out, completely happily, and it's actually lovely in drilling. The wobbliness issue is only really, you notice it strongly when it's in one hand. When you're holding it in two hand because of the length of the hilt, actually the blade's relatively stiff. Not as stiff as some Feders, and it does oscillate more than some Feders, I have to say. for reasons that are beyond my current understanding. And also just to add to this video, because I got some more sparring time in with the Sentinel, and so I've got some feedback to add to my previous review based on that, because I had used it for a couple of training sessions with sparring previous to that, but I used it more extensively in our last sparring session. The first thing to say is that I won't deny that the wobbliness is there, and it's notable particularly against stiffer feathers. So if your opponent's using a particularly stiff feather, some of the Reginier feathers, for example, can be quite stiff, then you do notice in a bind that you don't have as much authority in the bind with the Krieger Sentinel. So you might notice that. It depends what your sparring partners use. That being said, it's a problem with feathers. It's a problem in the competition world as well, because people with stiff feathers have an advantage. It's as simple as that, okay? They're slightly more responsive, and they're certainly a lot stronger in the bind, and when you thrust someone, they stay thrust. So the stop thrusts can be quite brutal with some of the really stiff feathers. So the more flexible the sword, the kinder it is to your training partners. And it has various other training artifacts as well to it, but it has to say it does increase the injury rate. One of the drawbacks, and this could result in things like broken ribs and that kind of stuff, and just generally more bruising. So the problem with stiff feathers is currently most competitions in HEMA don't mandate how stiff or flexible a sword has to be, and this is really a problem, particularly for rapier, particularly for longsword. Doesn't really seem to be so much of a problem for sabres, but with longsword and rapier, because there is a huge amount of advantage to having a stiffer blade, but it's also more likely to cause injury, and it makes it unfair if the other person's got a relatively more flexible blade. So it's a difficult topic. So the Krieger Sentinel is a relatively flexible blade. It's got a 39-inch blade, so it's pretty long, and it's relatively thin bar stock. But that being said, I absolutely love how it moves, and I would just reiterate again that the Sentinel, one of the strong points of the Krieger Sentinel is the hilt. It is just off the scale for the nicest hilt of any sparring longsword that I've ever owned. It's got the nicest shape and proportions, it just feels like a good quality sharp longsword in your hands, and the guard works very nice as well. And I have to say, personally, I did get one crack on the thumb that actually came slightly underneath my Zypher gloves, and get me on the end thumb. No injury, but just hurt a little bit. So yes, absolutely, without the shield, your hands, particularly your thumb, are more vulnerable. You can't get around that. But one of the plus sides of not having the shield is it's more like an actual sharp longsword. So if you become reliant on a shield and then you use a real sharp sword, you're not going to have a shield on it. So I like the fact that it doesn't have a shield, but you have to be wary of the fact that it doesn't have a shield. So it is relatively flexible with all of the things that entails. The hilt is absolutely fantastic. Durability, 100%. There's still practically no sign that it's been used. It's very hard, very springy. There's no bends, there's no dinting in the edges. The guard isn't even damaged so far. The durability and the quality, top notch. The hilt, top notch. And it's a lot of fun to spar with. And I'm actually enjoying, for years, having had a feather that was slightly on the short side compared to lots of people I fence with, I'm actually enjoying having a longer blade because I'm no longer at a reach disadvantage. So there is that as well. So it's a good quality, good sword. Whether you pick it will depend largely on what you're looking for out of your sparring longsword. And I would say if you've got a feather, getting one of these as well could be a real good complement to it, because it does give you a different experience of longsword sparring. There we go. It is a lovely looking thing. It's lovely to use for drilling, certainly. I'm actually going to be using it again for fencing this evening. If I have more feedback on the sparring usage of it as I go along, then I will report back to you. But really, that clarification, it does have distal taper and a very nice sword. As always, the link's below to the product. So I hope this has been a useful update, and I will see you. I've got the arming sword from Krieger to review as well in the not too distant future. So look out for that. And I hope this has been useful. Cheers for watching, guys.